Last week, I began a series on giving. I talked about the fact that we don't teach tithing here. I gave you some statistics from 2001, 2007, 2014, 2022 that basically show that Christians do a horrible job of adhering to tithing, even if they believe in it. And I talked about hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is how we interpret the Bible to figure out what it's saying to us. And so those are the two things that I framed before I continue on with the series, which really will start in earnest next week. Today's going to be an examination of history. But before we do that, in the spirit of Elba, which is on Wednesday night, we have some questions for investigation. We're going to look at what we're going to be learning about in the series. And so this is a short 12-question examination. That's probably the wrong word to use. But we're gonna use our phones here to go through this together. So if you have your phone, you can take a picture of that QR code, or you can go to menti.com and you can put in that number, and we will go through the questions for investigation. No test here, no test. And we will see kind of where we come out on this. All right. Everybody ready? Everybody got your phones? Anybody having trouble? Everybody getting in? All right, we'll see. All right, the word tithe, this is the first statement. The word tithe means a tenth or 1 out of every 10. A tenth or 1 out of every 10. I'll turn the results off here. $59 people, 60 people. All right? Let's show the results of this. 74% say true, 26% say false. All right? So we're gonna talk about that one today in today's lesson. All right, let's go to the next. Abraham was the first person in the Bible to adhere to a lifestyle of tithing. The results are supposed to be off. It's not working. It's all right. Abraham was the first person in the Bible to adhere to a lifestyle of tithing. Okay, so 15 say true, 47 say false, 16. We're going to be covering that one next week. Next question. Just FYI, Dr. Miller, I've discovered that on the iPad it's not as reliable. Okay. Jacob followed in his father's footsteps and was the second person in the Bible to adhere to a lifestyle of tithing. Jacob, true or false? Jacob followed in his father's footsteps and was the second person in the Bible to adhere to a lifestyle of tithing. All right, let's see the results. 42 say false, 21 say true. All right. Next question. There was only one method of tithing taught under the Mosaic Law. There was only one method of tithing taught under the Mosaic Law. True or false? You know, I considered that, man, I really did. All right, we're at 60. 10 say true, 55 say false. All right, next question. All Israelites, regardless of occupation, were required to tithe. All Israelites, regardless of occupation, were required to tithe. "38 say true, 26 say false." All right. Next question. Israelites tithe with agricultural goods because there was no monetary system in their day. Israelites tithe with agricultural goods because there was no monetary system in their day. "23 say true, 40 say false." Next question. Whenever an Israelite gave a tithe, they had to bring it to the priest and the tent of meeting or the temple. Whenever an Israelite gave a tithe, they had to bring it to the high priest and the tent of meeting or temple. True or false? "58 say true, 6 say false." Next question. Tithing was required by law for the Israelites. Tithing was required by law for the Israelites. "44 say true, 45 say true, 20 say false." All right, question 10. Tithing was exclusive to the nation of Israel. Tithing was exclusive to the nation of Israel. Okay, 19 say true, 46 say false. Question 11, tithing is still required today. It's taught by Jesus, Paul, and the author of Hebrews. Jesus, Paul, and the author of Hebrews. How's that for split the room? Last question. Tithing has been the predominant and consistent teaching of the church since the time of the apostolic fathers. Tithing has been the predominant and consistent teaching of the church since the time of the apostolic fathers. "34 say true, 29 say false." Okay, that's the end of the test. We're going to, the questions for investigation. It's hard to break out of that mode. We're going to shift over to the word now. The lesson now, not really word. This week I want to talk to you about history. I mentioned last week, if we want to understand how we got to where we're at today in 2023, we need to look at what we've been doing in history, we being the church global. And so that's what we're going to do. For those of you that love history or are intrigued by it, you will enjoy today. For those of you that would rather listen to anything else other than history, feel free to tune out and go to sleep. You're really not going to miss a whole lot. So just enjoy yourself. Think about what you're going to eat for the Super Bowl. All right, there is really no dispute that tithe means tenth or 1 out of every 10. That is true. That is the definition of tithe. The question at hand is whether the Bible requires a Christian to tithe of their income to the church, which is the predominant model of giving taught in America today. So I want to give you a survey of people in Christian history and whether or not they advocated the doctrine of tithing. Some of these names will be familiar to you. Others of these names will not be familiar to you at all, unless you've spent a lot of time in Bible school, probably. That's okay. The first place we want to look is beginning in the Ante-Nicene period, which is roughly 100 AD to 325 AD, when the Council of Nicaea was. This is an interesting period. This is where there was writing done by a bunch of figures of history that is called the Patristic Fathers. Some of these men you may have heard of mentioned before. Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Quadratus, Tatian, the Syrian, Hippolytus, Callistus, Novatian. All these guys with these noble sounding names, right? Now, the writing of these men is not considered authoritative in the sense that it bears the same weight as the scriptures do. But the writings of these men are very important because they were the first generation of Christians after the apostles. Polycarp, for example, is believed that he was either a disciple of Paul or a disciple of the apostle John, or both. He wrote a letter to the church at Philippi, the same way that Paul did. In his 80s, he was taken to see the local Roman proconsul Statius Quadratus, who began to interrogate him on his Christian beliefs in front of a crowd. And Polycarp wasn't really bothered by the interrogation. He carried on what's described as a witty dialogue with the proconsul. But as he continued to do that, Quadratus lost his temper with Polycarp because he always had an answer. And so he began to threaten him. And he threatened him with throwing him to wild beasts. He also threatened him with burning him at the stake. And so Polycarp said back to the proconsul, well, if you burn me at the stake, your fire lasts just a little while, but the fires of judgment that are with the fires of the He was threatened to be burned at the stake. And Polycarp said back to him, while your fire will last just a little while, the fires of judgment that are reserved for the ungodly cannot be quenched. So he said, why do you delay? Come and do what you will. So Quadratus's soldiers grabbed him and brought him and attempted to nail him at the stake to set him on fire. And he told them, leave me as I am, for he who grants me to endure the fire will enable me also to stand here unmoved, without the security that you desire from your nails. So he began to pray aloud as they lit the fire. and he was burned alive. And the person who chronicled his martyrdom said that the smell was that of fresh bread baking, or as silver and gold as it is refined in the furnace. I don't have a lot of time to go through with tremendous detail everything the patristic fathers had to say, but it's very interesting and fascinating. I've consolidated the list of characters in history so that we can see where they came down on this issue. So we're going to examine this list. The first list is those who present negative evidence of tithing. Now, negative evidence means they did not refute the principle of tithing with their writings, but their description of what was happening in the church of giving doesn't line up with what everyone believes tithing is. Clement of Rome and Justin Martyr and Tertullian all described offerings being placed in collection boxes put at the front of the sanctuary for the poor. So the people that came to church, if they had money, they put it in those collection boxes. If they didn't, they did not. Okay? So it wasn't exactly a system of 10%. It was pretty much the wealthy gave and the poor received out of those offerings. There was a document, a book back then called the Diadache. It's also known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. It's an early Christian discourse from the mid to late first century. Its author is unknown. The first line of it says, the teachings of the Lord to the Gentiles or the nations by the 12 apostles. The text has three main sections, and it deals with Christian ethics, Christian rituals such as water baptism and the taking of the Eucharist, and how church organization should be done. The Diadache was considered by some of the church fathers as part of the New Testament, but we know that it was later not included and not accepted in the New Testament canon. It never talks about obligatory giving or tithing, but it does talk about, there's a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 where Paul is talking to the Corinthian church about his right to receive a living from preaching of the gospel. And so the Diadache confirms that or talks about that aspect of it. The next list of people is those who were ambiguous in their statements. So we don't know where they came down on the doctrine of tithing. We don't know if they were for or against it, but I'll give you some of their comments. Cyprian's comments lead one to conclude that tithing was not practiced in his time, but he doesn't make any statements for or against it. Emperor Constantine did not collect or pay tithes, but he had a reputation as a very generous giver. Gregory of Nazianzus mentioned first fruits. He talked about the first fruits principle. When you receive an increase, you bring your first fruits to the Lord, but he did not tithe. Gregory of Nyssa has no references to tithes in his writings one way or another. Coming forward in history a little bit, we have Huldrych Zwingli. This is a guy who wrote about tithing in different ways depending on when he was writing in his ministry. He started out with very strong anti-tithing statements, but he mellowed over the years to a more accepted view. But he never did go back and recant any of those statements that he had made early on. Here's some names that you're probably very familiar with: John Calvin, John Knox, Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley. Basically, anyone named John was ambiguous. And Charles Spurgeon, interestingly. John Calvin held to a tithing model of some sort, but it's difficult to ascertain from what he wrote whether he was talking about it from the position of the church or whether he was talking about it from the position of the state. You know, as you went through history, there was times when the state was very involved with what the church was doing. In a lot of cases, sometimes tried to control it. Other times they were not. So there were times in church history, too, when tithing was treated as a tax, and they mandated it on people. So John Knox referred to tithes as taxes. He supported tithing as a tax, or some people are led to believe he supported tithing as a tax based on some of the things he wrote, but he also made statements at the same time that those that are poor or in need should not be required to pay taxes. John Selden wrote that tithes were not due, but he did not discourage tithes, and he advocated support for clergy. Jonathan Edwards affirmed that tithing was part of the ceremonial law, and he made statements that Christians should never give less than what was required of those under a previous era of time. John Wesley seemed to advocate tithing, but in the same conversation where he would advocate tithing, he would make statements that he didn't hold to it as well. He decided early in his ministry to live at as low as possible of an income level as he possibly could. His plan was to use only enough money to survive and to give the rest away. So in the 1700s, he calculated that he needed 28 pounds a year to live. And so he kept, in the first year of his ministry, he received 30 pounds in money. So he kept 28 and he gave away the other 2, right? Sometime later, about 10 years, if I remember correctly, he was taking in over 1,000 pounds a year, but he still lived off 28 and gave away everything else that was extra. So can't really say that that was a 10% belief. He was taking care of what his own needs were, and everything else that came out, he gave away. The guy that amazes me is Spurgeon. With all the writing that Spurgeon does, he never says anything that gives you any kind of indication where he comes down on the issue of tithing one way or another. And the guy wrote so much. So, okay. Next list we have are people or writings who advocated tithing by Christians. You have Clement of Alexandria. He concluded that Christians need to tithe. But he also advocated for a lot of other things that were done in Jewish tradition. He believed Christians should keep the sabbatical year and the year of Jubilee. So he brought forward, or believed in bringing forward, a lot of things from the law and the Old Covenant. Hilary of Poitiers, when he was commenting on Matthew 23, chapter 23, verse 23, which is a passage that we'll study, he concluded that while Christians should tithe, they should place a greater emphasis on mercy and justice and the things that Jesus talks of in that passage. Basil of Caesarea encouraged Christians to pay tithes. Ambrose stated that they were required. Cassian, Isidore of Pelusium, Caesarius of Arles, Eusebius, and Servinius, they all advocated tithing. The Second Synod of Macon made tithing church law. This was in the Middle Ages. In the year 604, they established that tithing should move from being a custom sanctioned by the law. Sorry, let me say that again. Tithing moved from being a custom to something that was required by church law in the Second Synod of Macon. And they made giving obligatory to the state. In the early Middle Ages, monasteries were required to pay tithes. So the governments, as it were, got involved in demanding tithes from the people. We also know this is called the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. This is when the church became very corrupt. And a lot of different things sprung up where the church would require things of people in exchange for money. The whole idea of purgatory and all that kind of stuff came along in this period of time. All right, Pope Gregory the Great in the year 600, Egbert in 750, Pippin in 750. The Synod of Rouen has an unknown date, probably they estimate around 879. Emperor Charlemagne, Offa the king of Mercia, King Edward, William the Conqueror, Bernard of Clairvaux, all those guys advocated tithing. Matthew Henry, the great Bible commentator, he advocated tithing. Charles Leslie advocated tithing. There was a guy, this is my favorite guy's name, Increase Mather. That's his name, Increase Mather. He was from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. in what would become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He was a Puritan minister. He was involved with the government of the colony. He was involved with the administration of Harvard College. And most notoriously, he was involved with the Salem witch trials. He wrote this: a discourse concerning the maintenance due to those that preach the gospel, in which the question whether tithes are by the divine law the ministers due is considered and the negative proved. That was the name of his book. He wasn't a pithy guy. He concluded that tithes are not due to ministers, but he did conclude that Christians should give at least 10%. William Bohun advocated tithings. John Gough, he wrote a thing called Tracts on Tithes in 1786. There was actually 3 tracts that came out at that time. One was called Plain Reasons Why the People Called Quakers May in Conscience and Ought in Duty to Pay Tithes. James Gambier, 1794, advocated for tithes. Richard Bellward advocated. William Edmeades. Cotton Mather, who happened to be Increase's kid, he was also a New England Puritan minister. He was a big author. Was a guy that started using pamphlets back in the day. Wrote a bunch of pamphlets. He vigorously supported the Salem witch trials. He was also a guy who got into science and advocated heavily for inoculations to prevent disease. And he tried to be the president of Harvard like his father did, but he was denied. He advocated for tithes. Charles Finney advocated for tithing based on the chapter of Malachi 3, which we'll talk about. Okay, the next list is people who advocated for tithing as a compromise. Origen, John Chrysostom, Jerome and Augustine, and Anastasius Syneeta advocated tithing, but they viewed it as a compromise to what they believed was the true command of the New Testament, which is that Christians are required to sell everything that they have and support the poor. And since they knew that Christians weren't going to do that, they said, we'll settle for tithing. Okay. Next list we have are those people or writings who were against tithes being binded on Christians. Didaskalia Apostolorum means the teaching of the apostles. It was a legal document about Christian practices. Many believe that it is a product of the original apostles, but now a lot of at that time they believed it. At this time in history, most scholars hold that it was produced near Antioch in the 4th century. But it did not advocate tithes on Christians. Epiphanes, he was a big advocate for the Didaskalia, and he quoted a lot of it. But he said tithing, like circumcision, is not binding on Christians. But he did also promote the idea of first fruit obligations. Thomas Aquinas, a famous scholastic Dominican monk, said that tithes were not part of the natural or moral law. They were only binding on believers because the Catholic Church had declared it so. If the church decided on something different, then he said that new thing would also be binding. John Wycliffe preached to the masses about the abuses of the tithing system. He was against the compulsory payment of tithes, and he advocated that they withhold their tithes, especially if they were being abused by the church. John Huss objected strongly to tithing. He believed that tithing should be alms to the poor instead. Giving had originally been voluntary, then customary, and then finally became obligatory, and he believed the primary purpose of voluntary alms was for the support of ministers and the poor. Erasmus, Otto Brunfels, They supported tithes in a lot of their teachings. These guys taught in Strasbourg. Otto wrote an essay in the 16th century on the issue, opposing it. You had in the time of Martin Luther, you may have heard about the German Peasant Revolt. So the German Peasant Revolt, they were also opposed to tithes. Martin Luther was opposed to tithes. He loved the Mosaic Law. He stated he wished he could take the Mosaic Law and apply it to his day, but he refused to say that that was appropriate. Anabaptists, particularly the Swiss Anabaptists, generally taught teachings were against tithes. Separatists in Amsterdam concluded that tithing as a religious law was not binding on Christians. John Smith is considered the first Baptist. He made very explicit statements that tithes were not binding on Christians. John Robinson, English Parliament. Again, you have a period of time when the government got into administering church. The English Parliament was opposed and resisted tithing laws, citing that tithing was not an eternal law, though many thought it was a good solution to this problem of the support of ministers. The Puritans and the Pilgrims of Massachusetts in the 17th century advocated for voluntary contributions for the support of ministers. John Cotton supported a voluntary system, rejected tithes for the support of ministers. Roger Williams is considered to be the first U.S. Baptist. He was of the same opinion as John Smith. He concluded that ministers of the gospel are to serve freely and be supported freely. Little Parliament. Little Parliament was a thing that came along at the same time as Oliver Cromwell was put in as prime minister, I believe, back then in England. They were opposed to tithe. John Milton, the guy who wrote Paradise Lost, wrote forcibly against tithes, which he considered ceremonial and that they were abolished. Oliver Cromwell had the same position as John Smith and Roger Williams. Baptists in general, there was a particular Baptist church in England. In their meeting minutes that had been preserved to modern day, they had very specific statements about how they were anti-tithing, and that came about as a result of a meeting where they were discussing how to support the minister of their church and pay income to him. John Owen declared that the claim of tithes are owed by John Owen declared that the claim that tithes are owed by God is, quote, a fond imagination, a dream that will fill them with perplexity when they shall awake. But he did also teach at the same time that Christians should abundantly give out of their worship to God. Francis Turton, pastor of the church in Geneva and professor of theology, declared that Christians are not bound by certain Old Testament laws, such as tithing and first fruits. He concluded that the method chosen for supporting the pastor should emphasize voluntariness. John Bunyan, author of Pilgrim's Progress, was against ceremonial things like tithes. John Milton and the Quakers declared tithes as non-binding on Christians. Adam Clarke went to great lengths to demonstrate the unjustness of tithing. He appeared to deny any kind of right to tithes and advocated for the abolishment of tithe laws. But he also advocated that it must be done in a way where the clergy are not put in a state of poverty. Charles Buck, J. Newton Brown, a Baptist and an author of the draft of the New Hampshire Confession of Faith, edited a dictionary that contained an article on tithes written by Charles Buck. The article explicitly said that tithes had ceased, and Brown copied that article word for word, even though he cited Charles Buck for the credit for writing it. So, in looking at all those lists, you have a very inconsistent position throughout history, right? That's how we break out. That was one of the questions that we had for investigation, is tithing the consistent position of the church taught through history. Well, there you have it. Now, there was a tithing renewal. A lot of these guys we just talked about were European. But what was happening in America? What was happening in North American history? What we find in American history is that Episcopalians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists did not have a tithing system in the 1800s. Dr. David Croto, the professor of Greek and New Testament for Columbia University, states that in their first days in America, the early 1600s, the Puritans and Pilgrims in New England believed that ministerial support should be by voluntary contributions from the congregation. Over time, they began to incorporate laws so that everyone in a community was compelled to give towards ministerial support. However, this period is marked by an effort to maintain the voluntariness of ministerial support. By the latter part of the 17th century, ministerial support was raised through taxes. In the early 18th century, as dissenting groups grew, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Quakers, and Baptists were allowed to pay these taxes to their own clergy. In 1818 in Connecticut and 1834 in Massachusetts, ministerial support reverted to being voluntary rather than a tax, as church and state were severed. In the 1850s, there was a period of time known as the Great Reform. There were essays that were put out written by various groups of people that emphasized stewardship, because there was a common recognition among Christians that ministers were not properly receiving the amount of support that they needed to live, and resources were scarce. So these writings began to come out. The first essay that was written on this was called The Divine Law of Beneficence by Parsons Cook. Cook said regarding tithing, the specific provisions of the tithe system have now vanished with the whole fabric of Hebrew institutions. But the end for which it was framed has never for a moment departed from the mind of the framer. And the general obligation to extend religion and feed the poor by free will offerings was far from being set aside in the fuller unfolding of the mercy of God in the gospel. Cook concluded that the tithe system was replaced by a simpler and nobler economy. He praised the new economy as a superior system to the old economy. The second essay was called Zacchaeus. It was also known as the Scriptural Plan of Benevolence. It was written by Samuel Harris. He said that Jews gave tithes, but the gospel, which is designed for all nations and ages, could not with equity fix the precise proportion. And it fits the entire character of the gospel, free grace from God, free love from man, to leave the decision of this point to the unconstrained love of those who have freely given all to Christ. Finally, the third essay that came out was The Mission of the Church, or Systematic Beneficence, by Edward A. Lawrence. He discussed in great detail the contributions of the Jews. It was considered a significantly scholarly work. But he concluded that inequality would result if any kind of fixed proportion system was adopted in the modern day and was applicable in all cases. Baptists in America during this period of time were specifically opposed to tithing. They believed in alms for the poor, and that Christians should give liberally to support their pastors. During this time, they also earned a reputation as being a little bit stingy, and it was widely considered that most of their ministers weren't adequately compensated. So that's interesting. They did not address any kind of issues about percentage of giving, but they left it up to people to decide. It wasn't until the Southern Baptist Convention of 1895 that they adopted a statement about tithing. So for 300 years, from 1600 to 1895, they considered it voluntary. And then in 1895, they changed their thing and said it should be obligatory. So how did it become the predominant model in the U.S. if there was all this conflicting things? Most people credit a guy named Thomas Paine with what's referred to as the rediscovery of the tithe. He was a businessman from Chicago. He was a Presbyterian. He wrote a pamphlet in 1876 called What We Owe and Why We Owe It. He mailed it out to 75% of the evangelical pastors in America at the time. He established an organization called the Layman Tithing Foundation. It still exists today. He eventually published a book in 1915 called Tithing and Its Results. And inside that book, he had 13 different little sections where he talked about tithing. But he went on a campaign to print these things and distribute these things all over America with the hopes that it would increase the giving of Christians to the church. And that's exactly what it did. So he gets most of the credit with the renewal of tithing. Although there were actually 2 books published right before his pamphlet that also advocated tithing. In 1873, a guy named A.W. Miller published The Law of the Tithe and the Free Will Offering. He concluded that this is what he wrote in his pamphlet, that the church fathers, the patristic fathers, were unified completely in their view on tithing. Did we see that? No. And that the teaching of tithing in the church had been a solid thing that went unchanged for the first 1,000 years of its existence. Did we see that? No. He said, tithes are not ceremonial since they don't belong to mankind, but they belong to God. He said the duty to tithe and the duty to keep the Sabbath are intertwined. Like I said, we know that the church fathers were not unanimous in their support of tithing, and we know that it did not go unchallenged for the first 1,000 years. The second book was by William Spear, and it was entitled God's Rule for Christian Giving, a practical essay on the science of Christian economy. He argued that God began to unfold his plan for supporting the church during the patriarchal age, Abraham and Jacob. Okay? And so occasional references were made to tithing. In the second stage, he said God brought the Mosaic law, brought in many specific details that were added to help people understand tithing. And in the final stage, under Christ, new motives of love and thanksgiving were grafted onto the foundation of tithing laid in the Mosaic law. We will examine that claim as we go through this study. So those are the 3 works that really opened the floodgates for several men to publish what their thoughts on tithing. In 1877, A.J. Gordon published a book called God's Tenth. In 1885, A.T. Robertson published a book called 5 times 5 Points of Church Finance. In 1895, N.L. Rigby published Christ Our Creditor, How Much Owest Thou? Most of these gentlemen argued that because the Jews gave 10%, Christians ought to be giving more. Finally, in 1906, Henry Lansdale published The Sacred Tenth. Well, sounds good, doesn't it? It was a 2-volume work on tithing and was also very scholarly. Many people attribute the modern tithing movement to Lansdale's book, and it was the authoritative reference on tithing for the next 99 years. So what was the authoritative reference on tithing? Somebody's book versus the book. This is still available on Google Books for free. If you're interested, I just checked yesterday. It's still there. You can read it if you'd like. If you have insomnia, it's one of your cures. Now, I want to put up on the screen just a bunch of names, a lot of modern leaders in America. And when I say modern, I mean the last 150 years. I hope you guys can see that at the back. You probably can. Pastor John, can you read that? You can. All right, good. Some of these names you'll recognize, some you won't. Okay, so these are guys who were ambiguous. And you see I kind of go from time there where they were made these statements up until modern times, okay? May or may not surprise some of you. In some of these names as we go through, I've have their denomination in there just to kind of show you, it's all over the map. All right. Let's go to the next one. Cautious advocates of tithing. These are guys that liked the tithe system. I think a lot of people through history liked the tithing system because it was just that, a system. There's a lot of fear when you give the decision over to people to operate based how they feel in their heart, especially if your pastor trying to pay your light bill. You get nervous. Okay? All right. Next. So these are all guys that advocated tithing, that slide before and this one. And there's going to be several of these. Billy Graham, God bless him. Going a little too fast. Go back one. It's all right. Some of these names, like I said, might be familiar, might not be. All right, go ahead. A.W. Pink. Elmer Towns. R.T. Kendall. So you see some names up there you'll be familiar with from this era. Okay, next. Larry Burkett. Charles Stanley. Okay, next. Gosh, if Hank Hanegraaff says it, must be him. He is the Bible answer man. Okay, next. Here's a list of people who taught against tithing. Okay, next. All right, next. Very. Next. Okay. So 1871 to present day, this is kind of where we shake out on it. 12 people, or 6%, who were ambiguous. 14, or 7%, who were cautious advocates. 73, or 35%, who were against. Or 108, or 52%, who are for tithing. So if we combine history from the ante-Nicene period up until the present day, this is how it shakes out. Next slide. Okay. So what this demonstrates is that there's been no consistent viewpoint. And I think that's sad. God's given us his word, right? It's supposed to instruct us. We're supposed to get things figured out. And we don't have a lot of common ground on this issue. So next week, we're going to start in Genesis with Abraham, and we're going to begin to look at what the scripture has to say about tithing.